Sometimes the most precious discoveries come from the smallest hands and the biggest hearts. When grief has settled into the corners of our lives like dust, it often takes a child's wonder to shake it loose and let the light back in. 7-year-old Lila Henderson spent her allowance on a rusted train at a yard sale, thinking she was just buying an adventure with her cat, Mews. The old locomotive had been sitting behind Pete's shed for years, forgotten by everyone except the memories it carried. But inside that weathered metal shell was a secret that would change everything. Hidden letters and photographs from 1949 told the story of a woman who disappeared on her honeymoon, leaving behind a sister who never stopped wondering what happened. Could this little girl's $5 purchase finally bring peace to a heart that had been waiting 70 years for answers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's quiet streets, painting the small town in the kind of golden light that made everything look like a memory waiting to happen. Saturday mornings here had their own rhythm. Coffee brewing in kitchen windows, the gentle hum of lawn mowers starting up, and the distant sound of screen doors opening as neighbors prepared for the weekly ritual that bound their community together. Yard sales. Lila Henderson pressed her face against her grandmother's kitchen window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched Pete Morrison arrange items in his backyard across the street. Her orange tabby cat, Mews, sat perched on the windowsill beside her, tail twitching with the same anticipation that sparkled in Lila's brown eyes. "Grammy, look," Lila whispered, pointing at the collection of forgotten treasures spreading across Pete's lawn. "He's got so much stuff. Do you think there might be something magical?" Dorothy Henderson smiled as she poured coffee into her favorite mug, the one with roses that had faded to pale pink after 20 years of morning routines. At 78, she'd learned to appreciate the way her granddaughter saw wonder in the ordinary world. Life had taught Dorothy to guard her heart carefully, especially after losing her son and daughter-in-law in that terrible accident 3 years ago. But Lila's presence in her home had slowly coaxed the warmth back into corners that had grown. "A cold with grief. Magic has a way of showing up when you're not looking for it, sweetheart," Dorothy said, settling into her chair at the small kitchen table. "But first, breakfast. Even treasure hunters need their energy." Lila reluctantly pulled away from the window, but Mews remained stationed at his post, green eyes fixed on the activity across the street. The cat had appeared on their doorstep. The same week, Lila came to live with Grammy, as if the universe understood that some losses require the comfort of unconditional love wrapped in fur and purrs. "Grammy, remember when you told me about allowances?" Lila asked, climbing into her chair and reaching for the jar of strawberry jam. "How they teach responsibility and the value of money." Dorothy's eyebrows lifted slightly. She recognized that tone, the careful way children approached conversations when they'd already made up their minds about something. "I do remember that conversation, yes. You've been saving your allowance for 6 weeks now." $5.37, Lila announced proudly, then paused to consider her words. "Mews and I have been talking, and we think we're ready to make an investment." "An investment?" Dorothy couldn't hide her smile. "That's a big word for a 7-year-old. Mrs. Patterson at school says smart people make investments. She says you put money into something that might be worth more later, or something that makes you happy for a long time." Lila's expression grew serious, the way it did when she was working through important thoughts. "Mews and I want to invest in an adventure." Dorothy glanced toward the window, where Pete was dragging something large and metallic from behind his garden shed. Even from this distance, she could see the rust-colored bulk of what looked like an old train car. She'd noticed it back there for years, partly hidden by overgrown honeysuckle vines and Pete's collection of lawn equipment. "That old thing's been sitting there since before you were born," Dorothy mused. "Pete bought it at an auction years ago, had some grand plan to restore it, but you know how Pete is with projects. Lila's eyes widened as she finally spotted the locomotive. "Grammy, it's perfect. It's like a real train just waiting for someone to believe in it again." There was something in her granddaughter's voice that made Dorothy's chest tighten with recognition. She'd heard that same note of determined hope before, in her own voice as a young woman, when she'd believed that wanting something badly enough could make it happen. Time had taught her that life was more complicated than childhood dreams, but looking at Lila's face, she remembered why those dreams mattered anyway. "Well then," Dorothy said softly, "I suppose we should go see what Pete's asking for that investment. Opportunity of yours." The morning air carried the scent of honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass as they crossed the street, Mews trotting behind them with the confident stride of a cat who knew he belonged wherever Lila went. Pete Morrison looked up from the card table where he was arranging fishing tackle, his weathered face breaking into a smile at the sight of his neighbors. "Morning, Dorothy, and good morning to you, Miss Lila," he said, tipping the baseball cap that seemed permanently attached to his gray head. "Mews, you old rascal, come to supervise the sale, have you?" Pete had the kind of voice that carried decades of Saturday mornings and front porch conversations, the sound of a man who'd watched children grow up and seasons change from the same corner of the world. At 75, he moved with the deliberate pace of someone who'd learned that rushing rarely improved anything important. "We're here on business, Mr. Pete," Lila announced, with the gravity of a seasoned negotiator. "Mews and I are interested in that train over there." Pete's eyes crinkled at the corners as he followed her gaze to the locomotive. "That old thing? Been meaning to do something with it for years now. Wife keeps telling me it's time to admit I'm never going to restore it." He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "What exactly did you have in mind, young lady?" "We'd like to buy it," Lila said simply, "for our investment portfolio." Dorothy bit back a laugh at her granddaughter's serious expression. Mews had already begun investigating the locomotive, weaving between the wheels and sniffing at the rusted metal with professional interest. "Well now," Pete said slowly, "that's a considerable piece of machinery you're talking about. Been sitting there for, must be 15 years now. Came from the old railroad yard when they were clearing out the antique cars." He walked over to the locomotive, running his hand along its dented side. "She's seen better days, that's for certain. Used to run passengers between here and Springfield back in the 40s and 50s. The locomotive stood about 8 feet tall and 12 feet long. Its green paint faded to the color of old sage and patched with rust that bloomed like flowers across its surface. The brass fittings had turned the color of pennies left in the rain, and wild morning glory vines had claimed the smokestack as their own. But even in its decline, the machine held a dignity that spoke of journeys taken and destinations reached. "How much?" Lila asked, her small hand resting on the side of the car with the reverence of someone touching history. Pete considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. He knew the locomotive wasn't worth much to most people. Certainly not enough to justify the space it took up in his backyard or the guilt it inspired every time his wife mentioned their retirement plans, but he also understood that value sometimes had nothing to do with money. "Tell you what," he said finally, "you seem like the kind of person who'd appreciate her properly. How about we say $5, and you promise to give her the respect she deserves?" Lila's face lit up like Christmas morning. $5. That's perfect. Mews, did you hear that? We can afford it." The transaction was completed with the solemnity of a real estate closing. Lila counted out 5 crumpled dollar bills from her small purse, while Mews conducted a thorough inspection of their new acquisition. Pete drew up an official-looking bill of sale on the back of a grocery receipt, signing it with a flourish and shaking hands with both Lila and Mews. "Congratulations," Dorothy said, watching her granddaughter beam with pride. "You're now the proud owner of a genuine locomotive. Not just any locomotive, Grammy, our locomotive." Lila climbed up into the cab, her small hands gripping the controls with the confidence of an engineer. "Mews, come see! We can go anywhere from here!" As Mews leaped gracefully onto the locomotive's platform, Dorothy felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of worry she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. There was something about watching Lila claim ownership of her dreams that reminded Dorothy of possibilities she'd forgotten existed. The rest of the morning passed in the sweet haze of childhood adventure. Lila conducted imaginary journeys, while Mews supervised from his perch on the locomotive's roof, and Dorothy found herself remembering what it felt like to believe that $5 could buy happiness. But the yard sale shoppers paused to smile at the sight of the little girl and her cat taking possession of their rusted kingdom, and several commented to Pete about what a fine thing it was to see children still using their imaginations. "She'll take good care of it," Dorothy assured Pete, as they watched Lila demonstrate the proper way to blow the whistle to Mews. "This might be the best $5 she's ever spent." Pete nodded, a satisfied expression settling over his features. "Some things are meant to be owned by people who can see their potential. That little girl sees something in that old train that the rest of us missed." Neither of them could have guessed how prophetic those words would prove to be, or how the locomotive's hidden potential would soon change more than just Lila's Saturday mornings. Sometimes the most important purchases are the ones that seem the most ordinary, and sometimes the best investments are made with pocket change and hope. As the sun climbed higher and the morning shadow shortened, Lila Henderson and Mews settled into their new domain with the satisfaction of explorers who'd found exactly what they'd been searching for, even if they hadn't known they were searching for anything at all. 3 days after the purchase, Lila had established a routine that would have impressed any railroad executive. Every morning after breakfast, she and Mews would conduct their inspection of the locomotive, checking the wheels, testing the whistle, and ensuring that all systems were ready for the day's imaginary journeys. Dorothy had grown accustomed to watching from the kitchen window as her granddaughter disappeared into a world where rusted metal became gleaming steel and overgrown weeds transformed into rushing landscapes. "All aboard for adventure," Lila called from the engineer's cab, her voice carrying across the quiet neighborhood with the authority of someone who took her responsibilities seriously. Mews, perched on the locomotive's roof like a furry lookout, flicked his tail in acknowledgement of the departure announcement. It was during their Tuesday morning expedition to the Wild West territories that Mews made the discovery that would change everything. While Lila navigated treacherous mountain passes from the safety of the conductor's seat, Mews had begun exploring the locomotive's interior with the methodical thoroughness that only cats possess. His investigation led him to squeeze through a gap behind what appeared to be a solid panel, his curiosity piqued by the hollow sound his paws made on the metal. "Mews?" Lila called when she noticed her co-engineer had vanished. "Where did you go? We're approaching the dangerous canyon, and I need my lookout." A muffled meow echoed from somewhere inside the locomotive's belly, followed by the sound of something metallic shifting. Lila climbed down from her perch and followed the sounds, pressing her ear against the wall where the meowing seemed strongest. "Mews, are you stuck?" she asked, running her small hands along the metal surface. Her fingers found the edge of what felt like a loose panel, and when she pushed against it, it gave way with a rusty groan. What opened before her was a hidden compartment, about the size of a small closet, that had been sealed away from light and weather for decades. Mews emerged from the darkness with cobwebs decorating his orange fur and something that looked like paper clutched gently in his teeth. "What did you find, boy?" Lila asked, accepting the offering with the solemnity of an archaeologist receiving an ancient artifact. The paper was yellowed with age and felt fragile beneath her fingers, but the handwriting was still clearly visible, graceful loops and careful letters that spoke of a time when penmanship mattered. Even though Lila was still learning to read cursive, she could make out enough words to understand that this was something important, something personal. "My dearest Edna," the letter began, and Lila's heart quickened with the thrill of discovery. If you are reading this, then perhaps there is still hope that the truth can be told. But the letter was just the beginning. As Mews continued his exploration of the hidden compartment, he emerged with more treasures. A small bundle of photographs tied with a faded ribbon, a leather journal with pages that whispered secrets when turned, and something that caught the morning light with a soft gleam, a wedding ring. Simple and gold, still beautiful despite the years. Lila gathered the items carefully, her 7-year-old mind understanding that she was holding someone's memories, someone's life. The photographs showed a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile, wearing a wedding dress that must have been the height of fashion in another time. In some pictures, she stood next to a tall man with serious eyes and a mustache that belonged to old movies. "Grammy needs to see this," Lila whispered to Mews, who was now busy grooming cobwebs from his whiskers. These belonged to someone who might be looking for them. The walk back to Grammy's kitchen felt different now, weighted with the importance of what she carried. Dorothy looked up from her crossword puzzle as Lila entered, and her expression immediately shifted to concern at the sight of her granddaughter's serious face. "What is it, sweetheart? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Lila said softly, placing the items gently on the kitchen table. "Mews found these inside the train, in a secret place." Dorothy set down her pencil and leaned forward, her eyes widening as she took in the collection of personal artifacts. The photographs drew her attention first. There was something familiar about the young woman's face, something that tugged at memories from long ago. "My goodness," Dorothy breathed, picking up one of the photographs with careful hands. "This is a wedding photo, from the 40s by the look of it." She studied the woman's face more closely, and a frown creased her forehead. "There's something about her. She reminds me of someone." Lila opened the journal to the first page, where the same careful handwriting had inscribed a name and date. "Margaret Rose Carraway, June 1949. "Carraway," Dorothy repeated, and her face went pale. "Oh, my dear Lord, Lila, I think you need to take these to the library, to Miss Edna." "Miss Edna from the library? Why?" Lila asked, though she was already gathering the precious items back into her arms. Dorothy's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her car keys. "Because Edna Carraway has been waiting 70 years for news of her sister Margaret, and unless I'm very much mistaken, you may have just found her." The drive to the Millbrook Public Library took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Dorothy gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, while Lila sat in the back seat, cradling the box of artifacts like they were made of spun glass. Mews had insisted on coming along, as if he understood the gravity of what his discovery might mean. The library was a small brick building that had served the town since 1923, its walls lined with books that had weathered decades of eager hands and curious minds. Edna Carraway had been its head librarian for 40 years, and in that time she'd become as much a fixture of the building as the card catalogue and the reading chairs by the front windows. At 73, Edna moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd found her calling early in life and had never looked back. Her silver hair was always pinned back in a neat bun, and her reading glasses hung from a chain that had been a gift from the Children's Reading Circle 10 summers ago. She had the kind of face that belonged in old photographs, elegant cheekbones, and eyes that held depth earned through years of both joy and sorrow. "Dorothy," Edna said with surprised pleasure as they entered the library, "what brings you in on a Tuesday morning? And hello there, Lila. I see you've brought Mews for a visit." Dorothy's voice caught in her throat as she looked at her old friend. They'd known each other for decades, had served on the same church committees and attended the same town functions, but Dorothy had never known how to bridge the gap that Margaret's disappearance had created in Edna's life. "Edna," Dorothy said softly, "Lila has something to show you, something she found in that old locomotive she bought from Pete Morrison." Lila stepped forward, her young face serious with the weight of responsibility. "Miss Edna, I think these might belong to you." or to your family?" She placed the box on the circulation desk, and Edna approached it with the wariness of someone who'd learned to be careful with hope. But when she saw the journal with her sister's name inscribed in familiar handwriting, the years fell away like autumn leaves. "Margaret," she whispered, her voice breaking on the syllables. "Oh, Margaret, where have you been?" Edna's hands shook as she lifted the journal from the box, her fingers tracing the faded cover with the reverence reserved for sacred things. The library fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the old clock above the circulation desk and the gentle purr that Mews had begun in response to the emotional charge filling the air. "Would you like to sit down?" Dorothy asked gently, recognizing the signs of someone receiving news that could either heal or shatter. Edna nodded, clutching the journal to her chest as they moved to the reading area where comfortable chairs surrounded a low table. Lila settled cross-legged on the carpet beside Mews, understanding instinctively that this was a moment requiring her quiet presence rather than her questions. "I haven't seen her handwriting in 70 years, Edna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'd know it anywhere. Margaret always wrote like she was creating art with every letter." She opened the journal carefully, and her eyes filled with tears at the sight of the first entry. "June 15th, 1949. Today I married Robert, and I should be the happiest woman alive. But there's something in his eyes when he thinks I'm not looking that makes me wonder if I've made a terrible mistake." "She was scared," Lila observed, with the simple directness that children use to cut through adult complexities. "Yes," Edna agreed, turning the page with trembling fingers. "She was scared, and she was alone, and I wasn't there to help her." The guilt that had lived in her heart for 7 decades colored every word. They continued reading together, Margaret's voice speaking across the years through carefully preserved ink. The photographs told their own story. A beautiful young woman, with Edna's same dark eyes and determined chin, standing next to a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. The wedding pictures showed a celebration that looked joyful from a distance, but the closer images revealed tension in Margaret's shoulders, a tightness around her mouth that spoke of doubts she couldn't voice. "Look at this one," Dorothy said softly, pointing to a photograph that had been tucked between the journal's pages. It showed Margaret alone, sitting on what appeared to be a train station bench, her wedding dress replaced by a simple traveling outfit. Her expression was one of desperate hope mixed with fear. "That must have been taken during their honeymoon trip," Edna said, studying her sister's face. "They were supposed to travel through several small towns, including Millbrook. Robert said it would be romantic to see the countryside by train." Lila had been quiet during this examination, but now she reached into the box and carefully withdrew the wedding ring. The gold caught the library's fluorescent light, casting tiny rainbows on the table's surface. "This is beautiful," she said, holding it up for Edna to see. But why wasn't she wearing it? Edna's breath caught as she recognized the ring, a simple gold band with a tiny diamond that had belonged to their grandmother. "She never took it off," Edna whispered, "even when she was doing dishes or working in the garden. She said it reminded her that she was loved." "Then why is it here?" Lila asked, and the question hung in the air like smoke. Dorothy and Edna exchanged glances over the child's head, both understanding the implications that Lila was too young to fully grasp. If Margaret had removed her wedding ring, if she'd hidden her most precious possessions in a secret compartment, then her disappearance hadn't been the random tragedy everyone had assumed. "May I see the journal again?" Edna asked, and Lila handed it over with the same careful reverence she'd shown all morning. Edna turned to the final entries, reading her sister's increasingly worried words with a heart that broke anew for each. Fear Margaret had faced alone. "June 20th, 1949. I've discovered that Robert owes money to dangerous people, bad people. He's been gambling, and now they're demanding payment. He thinks I don't know, but I hear him on the telephone late at night pleading for more time. June 21st, 1949. We're in a place called Millbrook now, staying at the town's only hotel. Robert has been drinking heavily, and when he drinks, he says things that frighten me. I've been walking around town, trying to think clearly. There's a lovely librarian here who reminds me of home. Maybe I could ask her for help. Edna's eyes widened. She was here. She was in Millbrook, and she was looking for help. The librarian she mentioned, Dorothy said carefully. Do you think that was Mrs. Patterson? She ran the library before you did? It must have been. Oh, how I wish I'd known. How I wish she'd found me instead. Edna's voice cracked with the weight of missed connections and lost opportunities. Lila had been following the conversation with the intense focus that children bring to adult mysteries. Miss Edna, what happened to your sister? Why did she disappear? It was the question that had haunted Edna for 70 years, the question that had shaped her quiet life and careful heart. She looked at this brave little girl who'd brought her sister's voice back from the silence, and she found herself able to speak truths she'd rarely voiced, even to herself. I don't know what happened to her, sweetheart. She and Robert were on their honeymoon, traveling by train through small towns like ours. They were supposed to return home after 2 weeks, but they never did. Robert's body was found in a river 3 towns over, and the police said it looked like he'd been drinking and fell in. But Margaret was never found. What did the police think happened to her? Dorothy asked gently. They said she must have panicked when Robert died. They thought she might have tried to make her way home alone and gotten lost, or maybe fallen into the water trying to save him. Her suitcase was missing from their hotel room, so they believed she'd left on her own. Edna's voice grew bitter. But I knew Margaret. She would never have just disappeared without telling me. She would have found a way to get word to me, no matter what. Mews chose that moment to jump onto the table, padding carefully around the precious artifacts to settle next to the journal. His green eyes fixed on Edna with the intensity that cats reserve for humans in distress, and his purr grew louder. Mews likes you, Lila observed. He only purrs like that for people he thinks need comforting. Edna reached out to stroke the cat's orange fur, and some of the tension left her shoulders. These items, she said, gesturing to the collection spread before them, they're like pieces of a puzzle I've been trying to solve my whole life. But I'm afraid of what the complete picture might show. Sometimes the truth is scary, Lila agreed, with the wisdom of someone who'd already learned that growing up meant facing difficult realities. But Grammy says that not knowing is usually scarier than knowing. Dorothy smiled proudly at her granddaughter. That's right, sweetheart. And now, thanks to you and Mews, Miss Edna has a chance to finally learn what really happened to Margaret. Edna gathered the photographs back into a neat stack, her movements careful and deliberate. I'd like to study these more carefully if you don't mind. There might be other clues in Margaret's journal, details that could help us understand what she was going through during those final days. Of course, Lila said immediately. They're yours anyway. We just found them for you. As they prepared to leave the library, Edna caught Lila's hand in her own. Thank you, dear one. You've given me something I never thought I'd have again. Hope, and the chance to hear my sister's voice one more time. Walking back to the car, Lila looked up at her grandmother with thoughtful eyes. Grammy, do you think we'll be able to solve the mystery? Do you think we'll find out what really happened to Margaret? Dorothy considered the question carefully, watching Edna through the library windows as she bent over her sister's journal, with renewed purpose. I think, sweetheart, that some mysteries are meant to be solved, and sometimes it takes fresh eyes and brave hearts to see what others have missed. The following morning brought rain, the kind of gentle, steady precipitation that turns summer gardens into watercolor paintings and makes libraries feel like sanctuaries. Lila pressed her nose against Grammy's kitchen window, watching the droplets race down the glass, while Mews sat beside her, tail twitching at the birds taking shelter under the eaves. Can we visit Miss Edna today? Lila asked, her breath fogging. The window. I want to know what else Margaret wrote in her journal. Dorothy looked up from her coffee and the morning paper, noting the urgency in her granddaughter's voice. Over the past day, Lila had asked dozens of questions about the mysterious Margaret, each one revealing how deeply the discovery had captured her imagination. "I'm sure Miss Edna would appreciate the company," Dorothy said. "But remember, this is very emotional for her. She's been wondering about her sister for a very long time." 20 minutes later, they arrived at the library to find Edna waiting for them, Margaret's journal open on the desk before her. Her eyes were rimmed with red, but there was something different about her posture, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there yesterday. "I've been reading all night," Edna said without preamble, as they settled into the familiar chairs. "Margaret wrote about so much more than I realized. Her fears, her hopes, and—" She paused, looking directly at Lila. "Some very important information about what was happening during her honeymoon." Mews immediately claimed his spot on the table, positioning himself as if he understood his role as guardian of the artifacts. Lila leaned forward eagerly, her young face serious with concentration. "What kind of information?" Dorothy asked gently. Edna opened the journal to a page marked with a library bookmark. "This entry is from June 22nd, their last night in Millbrook. Listen to this. I overheard Robert on the telephone tonight, and now I understand how much danger we're both in. The men he owes money to aren't just angry, they're threatening. They know where we are, and they're coming here. Robert thinks he can negotiate with them, but I've seen the fear in his eyes. I've hidden the ring and this journal where Robert will never think to look. If something happens to me, maybe someone will find these things someday and know that I tried to get home to Edna." The words hung in the quiet library air like autumn leaves suspended before falling. Lila's eyes widened as she processed what she'd heard. "She knew something bad might happen," Lila said softly. "That's why she hid everything in the train." "But why the train?" Dorothy wondered aloud. "How did she even access it?" Edna turned to another marked page. "She explains that here, the locomotive at the station isn't running anymore. The railroad man said it was being retired after this route. But it's unlocked, and there are places inside where a person could hide if necessary. I've been walking past it every day, thinking about how trains are supposed to take people home. Maybe this one could take me home too, if I could just find the courage to leave Robert." "She was planning to escape," Dorothy said, understanding dawning in her voice. "There's more," Edna continued, her voice stronger now. "June 23rd. Tomorrow is our last day in Millbrook. Robert says we're taking the morning train to the next town, but I've made a different plan. I've bought a ticket on the afternoon train back home. I'm going to tell Robert I need time to think, and then I'm going to hide in the old locomotive until he leaves on the morning train. Then I'll take the afternoon train home to Edna. I'll explain everything to her, and together we'll figure out what to do about Robert's debts." Lila had been following every word with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. "But she never made it home," she said, "so something went wrong with her plan." Edna nodded, tears threatening again. "This is the last entry in the journal. After this, nothing. The pages that follow are torn out." "Torn out?" Dorothy leaned closer to examine the journal. "By whom?" "That's what we need to find out," Edna said with determination. "But first, I want to show you something else Margaret left behind." She reached into a manila envelope and withdrew several photographs that hadn't been in the original collection. These were different. Not formal wedding pictures, but candid shots that seemed to have been taken secretly. These were tucked inside the back cover of the journal, Edna explained. "I think Margaret was documenting something. The photographs showed Robert with other men, rough-looking individuals whose faces belonged in police files rather than wedding albums. In one picture, money was being exchanged. In another, Robert appeared to be pleading, while the other men looked threatening. She was building evidence," Dorothy said with growing understanding. "Margaret was trying to document what was happening." Lila studied the faces in the photographs with the careful attention that children bring to details adults might miss. "That man," she said, pointing to one of the rough-looking individuals, He looks familiar, not like I know him, but like I've seen his face before. Edna and Dorothy exchanged glances. Where might you have seen him, sweetheart? Dorothy asked. In Grammy's old photograph albums, Lila said slowly, her forehead creased with concentration. The ones with pictures of Millbrook from a long time ago. There was a picture of policemen at some town celebration, and I think he was one of them. The implications of this observation settled over them like a cold shadow. If one of the men threatening Robert had been a local policeman, it would explain how Margaret's disappearance had been so thoroughly covered up, so easily dismissed as a tragic accident. Lila, Edna said carefully, are you certain about this? I think so. Grammy, can we look at those old photo albums when we get home? I want to be sure. Dorothy nodded, but her expression was troubled. If Lila was right, it meant Margaret's disappearance hadn't been random at all. It had been orchestrated by people who should have been protecting her. Edna seemed to read Dorothy's thoughts. If Margaret was killed, and if local law enforcement was involved, then her disappearance was never really investigated properly. What do we do now? Dorothy asked. The people who might have been responsible are probably dead by now. It's been 70 years. We find out the truth, Lila said, with the simple conviction that made adults remember why they'd once believed. Injustice. Margaret wanted people to know what happened. That's why she left all these clues. Edna looked at this remarkable child who had brought her sister's voice back from the silence and felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. The possibility of answers. You're right, dear one. Margaret deserves to have her story told. Even if it's 70 years late, she gathered the photographs back into their envelope with careful hands. And I think she'd be proud to know that it was a brave little girl and her cat who finally gave her a voice. As they prepared to leave the library, Mews performed his own investigation of the journal, sniffing at the pages as if he could detect secrets that human senses missed. His whiskers twitched, and he looked up at Lila with an expression that seemed to say the mystery was far from solved. "What is it, boy?" Lila asked, scratching behind his ears. "Do you think there are more secrets waiting for us?" Mews purred and rubbed against the journal, as if to say that some mysteries reveal themselves only to those patient enough to keep looking. And as they walked back into the gentle rain, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that their investigation was just beginning. The rain had stopped by afternoon, leaving Millbrook's streets glistening and fresh. Lila insisted on returning to the locomotive before dinner, claiming she needed to check on something important. Dorothy and Edna accompanied her, both women understanding that sometimes the most significant discoveries happen when we're not actively searching. Mews led the way across Pete's backyard, his tail held high with the confidence of a cat who knew. He was about to prove his worth once again. The locomotive stood exactly where it had been that morning, but somehow it looked different now, less like abandoned machinery and more like a keeper of secrets. "Show me exactly where you found the first compartment," Edna asked Lila, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades helping people research mysteries both large and small. Lila climbed into the locomotive's cab and pointed to the panel that Mews had discovered. "Right here. But Mews was sniffing around other places too, weren't you, boy?" As if summoned by his name, Mews began another methodical exploration of the locomotive's interior. This time, however, his investigation led him to a different area, near the coal tender, where metal plates had been riveted together in a pattern that looked slightly different from the rest. "There," Lila said, following Mews's focused attention. "He's found something else." Dorothy watched nervously as her granddaughter and the cat disappeared into the bowels of the old machine. "Be careful in there, sweetheart. That metal has been rusting for decades." But Lila's excited voice soon echoed from within. "Miss Edna, there's another hiding place, and it's got stuff in it." When she emerged, her clothes dusty and her hair decorated with cobwebs, Lila carried a small cloth bag that clinked softly. With each movement, Mews followed, looking pleased with his detective work. "More treasures?" Edna asked, accepting the bag with hands that trembled slightly. The bag contained items that told a different story than Margaret's personal effects. There were crumpled IOUs written in Robert's handwriting, each one bearing increasingly desperate promises to pay back substantial sums. There were also several notes in different handwriting, threats that made no attempt to disguise their violent intentions. "Pay up or pay the price," one note read. "We know where you are, and we know where your pretty wife is too." But it was the last item that made all three women gasp. A tarnished sheriff's badge, its metal dulled by time, but its significance blazing clear. "Why would there be a sheriff's badge hidden in the locomotive?" Dorothy asked, though her expression suggested she was beginning to understand. Edna turned the badge over in her hands, noting the number engraved on its back. 147. This was issued by Millbrook County. I remember seeing badges like this in old newspaper photographs from the 40s and 50s. Lila had been quietly studying the threatening notes, sounding out words with the careful concentration she brought to her schoolwork. "Miss Edna, this word here, it looks like sheriff, and this one says Cooper." "Sheriff Cooper," Edna repeated, slowly. "Of course, Samuel Cooper was the sheriff in 1949. He was the one who investigated Margaret's disappearance, or claimed to investigate it. The implications hung heavy in the afternoon air. If Sheriff Cooper's badge was hidden in the locomotive along with evidence of Robert's gambling debts and the threats against him, it suggested a level of corruption that would have made a proper investigation impossible. Margaret wasn't just trying to escape Robert, Dorothy realized aloud. She was trying to escape a conspiracy that included the very person who was supposed to protect her. Edna's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "We need to find out more about Sheriff Cooper, and we need to understand how all of this ended up hidden in the locomotive." "I know someone who might remember," Dorothy said thoughtfully. "Eleanor Mitchell lives in the senior center now, but she used to run the telegraph office in 1949. If anyone would remember the details of what happened that summer, it would be Eleanor." The Millbrook Senior Center occupied a converted Victorian mansion on the town's main street, its wraparound porch dotted with rocking chairs and flower boxes that spoke of comfortable afternoons and shared memories. Eleanor Mitchell, at 91, was still sharp enough to beat anyone at bridge and observant enough to notice when something didn't add up. "Margaret Carraway," Eleanor repeated when they'd settled in the center's sunny visiting room. "Of course I remember. Such a tragedy and so mysterious. But you know, I always wondered about the official story." Lila sat cross-legged on the floor beside Mews, both of them listening with the intense focus that children and cats bring to adult conversations when they sense important information being shared. "What didn't make sense to you?" Edna asked, leaning forward in her chair. Eleanor's eyes, still bright despite her age, took on the focused expression of someone accessing memories filed away for decades. "Well, first, there was the matter of the telegraph messages. Robert had been sending and receiving quite a few during their stay in Millbrook. Urgent messages, the kind that made the telegraph lines buzz with importance." "What kind of messages?" Dorothy asked. "Messages to Chicago, mostly. Names I didn't recognize, but the tone was always desperate. Need more time. Can arrange payment. That sort of thing. But here's what struck me as odd. After Robert's body was found, Sheriff Cooper came to the telegraph office and demanded all records of those messages." Edna's breath caught. "He destroyed the evidence?" "He claimed it was part of the investigation, but he burned everything right there in the office stove. Said it would protect the family's privacy." Eleanor shook her head. "But I had a good memory in those days, and some of those messages mentioned meeting locations right here in Millbrook." "Meeting locations?" Dorothy pressed. "The old railroad yard, specifically, where the out-of-service locomotives were kept." Eleanor looked directly at Lila. "I believe that's where your train came from, dear." Lila's eyes widened as the connections became clear. "So Margaret wasn't just hiding in any train. She was hiding in the exact place where Robert was supposed to meet the bad men. It appears that way, Eleanor agreed. But here's the strangest part of all. I saw Sheriff Cooper at the railroad yard the morning after Robert's body was found. He was there with 2 other men, and they were loading something heavy onto a truck. The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and Mews's gentle purring. Each woman was processing the implications of what Eleanor had just revealed. "Mrs. Mitchell," Edna said carefully, "do you think Margaret might have witnessed something that night? Something that made her dangerous to certain people?" Eleanor nodded gravely. "I think Margaret saw exactly what happened to Robert, and I think she tried to document it, just like any smart woman would do if she found herself in danger. But if she had evidence," Dorothy wondered, "why didn't she just go to the authorities?" Eleanor's laugh held no humor. "My dear, the authorities were part of the problem. Sheriff Cooper wasn't investigating a crime, he was covering one up. And a young woman alone, with no family nearby and no one to believe her story, wouldn't have stood a chance against that kind of corruption." As they prepared to leave the senior center, Eleanor caught Lila's hand in her own papery fingers. "You're doing something important, child. Some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry alone, and Margaret has been carrying hers for far too long." Walking back to the car, Lila looked up at the 2 women who had become her partners in this unexpected investigation. "So, Margaret didn't disappear," she said with the clarity that sometimes comes from young minds uncluttered by adult assumptions. "Someone made her disappear." The next morning arrived grey and heavy, with clouds that promised another afternoon of rain. Lila woke early, her dreams filled with trains and mysteries, and a young woman's voice calling across decades. She found Grammy already in the kitchen, surrounded by photo albums and old newspapers spread across the table like pieces of a historical puzzle. "I couldn't sleep either," Dorothy admitted when she saw her granddaughter in the doorway. "I kept thinking about what Mrs. Mitchell told us yesterday." Lila padded over to the table, Mews trailing behind her with the deliberate pace of a cat who understood that important work was being done. The photo albums were familiar. Grammy had shown them to her before, but now Lila studied them with different eyes, searching for faces that might connect to their growing mystery. "There," she said suddenly, pointing to a black-and-white photograph, "from a 1949 4th of July celebration. That's the man from Margaret's pictures, the one with Robert." Dorothy leaned closer, adjusting her reading glasses. The photograph showed several uniformed officers standing proudly beside a banner that read, "Millbrook County Sheriff's Department." The man Lila indicated stood slightly apart from the others, his expression serious even in celebration. "Deputy Marcus Webb," Dorothy read from the caption beneath the photo. "If you're right, then Deputy Webb was one of the men threatening Robert." "But he was a policeman," Lila said, confusion clear in her voice. "Policemen are supposed to help people, not hurt them." Dorothy felt the familiar ache that came with explaining adult betrayals to a child's trusting heart. "Sometimes people don't do the jobs they're supposed to do, sweetheart. Sometimes they do bad things even when they wear badges that are meant to represent good things." Edna arrived just as they were examining a newspaper article from July 1949, headlined, "Sheriff Investigates Disappearance of Honeymooning Couple." The article was brief and contained few details, but it painted Sheriff Cooper as a dedicated lawman, working tirelessly to solve a tragic mystery. Sheriff Cooper stated that every effort is being made to locate Mrs. Margaret Carraway. Edna read aloud, her voice bitter. "He believes she may have suffered trauma following her husband's accidental death and warns that she may be confused and disoriented." "He was already preparing excuses," Dorothy observed, "making sure that if anyone saw Margaret acting frightened or desperate, they'd think she was just a grieving widow who wasn't thinking clearly." Lila had moved on to another album, one filled with railroad photographs that Pete Morrison had donated to the town's historical society years earlier. "Look at this," she called, pointing to a picture that made all three women draw sharp breaths. The photograph, dated June 1949, showed the Millbrook Railroad Yard with several locomotives in various states of repair. But it wasn't the trains that captured their attention. It was the people in the background. Sheriff Cooper stood beside the locomotive that now sat in Pete's backyard, and he was talking to two men whose faces they now recognized from Margaret's hidden photographs. "This proves they were all working together," Edna said, her voice shaking, with anger that had been building for 70 years. Cooper, Webb, and whoever the third man was, they were all part of Robert's gambling operation. Or they were trying to collect Robert's debts for the people he owed money to, Dorothy suggested. Either way, they weren't investigating Margaret's disappearance, they were covering up her murder. The word murder hung in the kitchen air like smoke, making the morning feel colder and the mystery more urgent. Lila reached out to pet Mews, drawing comfort from his warm fur and steady purr. "If they killed Margaret," Lila said quietly, "where is she now? Where did they put her?" It was a question none of them wanted to answer, but Edna forced herself to consider the possibilities with the methodical approach she'd learned from decades of library research. Eleanor said she saw them loading something heavy onto a truck. "If they moved her that same night, the old mine," Dorothy said suddenly. "There used to be a played-out copper mine about 10 miles north of town. People sometimes dumped things there that they didn't want found." Edna's face went pale. "You think that's where they took her?" "I think it's possible. The mine was abandoned by the 40s, and it would have been a perfect place to hide evidence." Dorothy looked at Lila's serious face and felt a wave of protectiveness. "But that's something for adults to investigate, not children." "But we found all the clues," Lila protested. "Mews and I are part of this mystery, too." Before Dorothy could respond, the telephone rang. Edna answered it with the automatic politeness of someone accustomed to library patron inquiries, but her expression quickly changed to one of concern. "Yes, Mr. Morrison," she said. "We'll be right over." She hung up and turned to Dorothy and Lila with worried eyes. "That was Pete. He says someone broke into his shed last night and was searching around the locomotive. He found evidence that someone had been digging nearby. The drive to Pete's house took only minutes, but it felt like hours. When they arrived, they found Pete standing beside his shed with a grim expression, holding what appeared to be a crowbar and a flashlight. "Happened sometime after midnight," he explained without preamble. "I heard my dog barking, but by the time I got outside, whoever it was had gone. But look at this." He led them to the area around the locomotive, where the ground showed clear. Signs of recent disturbance. Someone had been digging, and not randomly. The holes were concentrated in specific areas, as if the intruder had been looking for something particular. "They knew exactly where to look," Edna observed, studying the pattern of excavation. "This wasn't random vandalism. Someone was searching for something specific." Mews began his own investigation of the disturbed earth, his whiskers twitching, as he caught scents that human noses couldn't detect. Suddenly, he sat down next to one of the holes and began meowing insistently. "What is it, boy?" Lila knelt beside her feline partner, following his gaze into the shallow excavation. There, partially exposed by the intruder's digging, was a piece of fabric, faded blue cotton that might once have been part of a dress or blouse. Next to it, something metallic caught the morning light. Pete carefully extracted both items with his gardening tools, revealing a brass button and a fragment of cloth that looked like it had been buried for decades. But it was the third item that made everyone's breath catch, a small, tarnished locket on a broken chain. Edna's hands shook as she opened the locket, revealing two tiny photographs inside. One showed a young Edna herself, probably in her 20s. The other showed their parents, long since passed away. "This was Margaret's," Edna whispered. "She wore it every day. It was our mother's, and she gave it to Margaret on her wedding day." The implications were clear to everyone standing around the locomotive that morning. Margaret hadn't just hidden her possessions in the train car. The train car had been her final resting place. Someone had buried her nearby, and that same someone had returned last night, probably hoping to remove any remaining evidence before their secret was discovered. "We need to call the police," Dorothy said, but Pete shook his head. "Current police, yes, but we need to be careful about who we trust with this information. If there's still family around who might want to protect the reputation of Sheriff Cooper or Deputy Webb, then we need to document everything ourselves first," Edna said with sudden determination. "We need to make sure Margaret's story gets told, no matter who tries to stop us." Lila looked up at the adults surrounding her, understanding that their investigation had just become something much more serious and much more dangerous. But when she looked down at Mews, who was still sitting alertly beside the disturbed ground, she saw the same determination in his green eyes that she felt in her own heart. Margaret had been waiting 70 years for someone to find her and tell her story. They weren't going to let her wait any longer. By afternoon, Pete's backyard had become the center of an investigation that spanned 7 decades. The current police chief, a thoughtful man named David Rodriguez, who had moved to Millbrook only 5 years earlier, listened carefully as Edna, Dorothy, and Lila explained their discoveries. Unlike his predecessors, Chief Rodriguez had no family ties to the town's old corruption and no reason to protect long-buried secrets. "This is extraordinary," he said, examining Margaret's locket and the other artifacts they'd collected. "If what you're suggesting is true, then a murder was covered up by the very people sworn to investigate it." "We know it sounds incredible," Edna said, "but the evidence speaks for itself. My sister tried to document what was happening to her, and she hid that documentation where she thought it would be safe." Chief Rodriguez had brought along the county's forensic specialist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who approached the disturbed ground around the locomotive with scientific precision. She'd already begun the careful process of excavating the area where Mews had found the fabric and locket. "Chief," Dr. Chen called from where she knelt beside one of the holes, "you need to see this." What she'd uncovered made everyone's suspicions horrifyingly real. Partially buried beneath decades of accumulated soil and debris were human remains, bones that had been hidden in a shallow grave for 70 years. But it was what lay beside the remains that transformed their investigation from historical mystery into active criminal case. Dr. Chen carefully extracted what appeared to be a metal document tube, the kind used to protect important papers from moisture and decay. Inside the tube, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a collection of items that Margaret had managed to hide even from her killers. Photographs, documents, and a letter addressed to whoever finds this. "She knew she was going to die," Chief Rodriguez said quietly as he read Margaret's final letter. "And she made sure the evidence would survive, even if she didn't." The letter was written in Margaret's careful handwriting, but the words shook with terror and desperation. "If you are reading this, then Robert and I are both dead, and the men who killed us think they have gotten away with murder. Robert owed money to dangerous people in Chicago, but the debt collection was being handled by local law enforcement who were taking a percentage of what they collected. Sheriff Cooper has been running a criminal operation out of the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. He and his deputies have been collecting gambling debts for Chicago crime families, using their badges to intimidate victims and cover up their crimes. When Robert couldn't pay what he owed, they decided to make an example of him. I witnessed Robert's murder. It wasn't an accident or suicide. Sheriff Cooper and Deputy Webb beat him to death and threw his body in the river. They're planning to kill me too, because I saw everything, and they know I won't stay quiet. I've hidden this evidence where I pray someone will eventually find it. The locomotive is scheduled to be decommissioned and moved to storage, where maybe someday someone will discover what happened to us. I've included photographs of Sheriff Cooper meeting with the Chicago men, documents showing how they laundered money through fake arrests and evidence seizures, and proof that they've been doing this to other families too. My name is Margaret. Rose Caraway, and I want my sister Edna to know that I tried to come home to her. I was planning to escape on the afternoon train, but they found me first. If anyone reads this, please tell Edna that I never stopped loving her, and I never stopped trying to find a way back to her. The locomotive has become my tomb, but I pray it will also become my voice. The silence that followed Chief Rodriguez's reading of the letter was profound. Even Mews seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, sitting quietly beside Lila, with his ears alert and his green eyes fixed on the adults whose world had just been turned upside down. "There's more," Dr. Chen said, her voice tight with professional control over personal outrage. She held up a small leather journal, different from the one they'd found earlier, and filled with Margaret's documentation of the corruption she'd witnessed. The journal contained meticulous records of Sheriff Cooper's criminal activities, names, dates, amounts of money, and detailed descriptions of how the legitimate sheriff's department had been transformed into a criminal organization. Margaret had been keeping track of everything, probably planning to take her evidence to federal authorities once she escaped Robert's dangerous situation. She was building a case, Chief Rodriguez said with admiration. This young woman was single-handedly investigating a criminal conspiracy that reached from Chicago to our little town. But it was the final item in the document tube that provided the most shocking revelation of all. Among Margaret's carefully preserved evidence was a photograph that made everyone gasp. Sheriff Cooper and Deputy Webb standing beside a freshly filled grave, their faces clearly visible in the flash photography of the era. She photographed her own burial site, Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper. She knew exactly what they were planning to do with her body. Lila had been listening to the adults with the focused intensity she brought to important moments, but now she spoke up with a question that cut to the heart of their discovery. If Margaret knew all this was going to happen, and if she left all this evidence, why wasn't Sheriff Cooper ever caught? Chief Rodriguez exchanged glances with Dr. Chen, both of them understanding the implications of the child's question. "Because," he said carefully, "no one ever found the evidence. The locomotive was moved to Pete's property and forgotten, and..." Margaret's voice was silenced for 70 years. "But someone knew," Edna said suddenly, her librarian's mind making connections that others had missed. "Someone has always known the truth about what happened to Margaret, and that someone came here last night looking for evidence." "You mean there's still someone alive who was involved in the cover-up?" Dorothy asked. "Not necessarily involved, but aware," Chief Rodriguez corrected. "Maybe a family member who inherited the secret. Maybe someone who's been living with the knowledge of what their father or grandfather did back in 1949. Lila looked around at the adults, then down at Mews, who had begun exploring the area around Margaret's grave with renewed interest. "Mews is trying to tell us something else," she observed. "Look at how he's acting." The cat was indeed behaving strangely, padding back and forth between the gravesite and the locomotive, with his tail bristled and his whiskers twitching. Every few steps, he would stop and meow insistently, as if trying to communicate something urgent. "What is it, boy?" Lila asked, following Mews as he led her to a spot near the locomotive's front wheels. There, barely visible beneath decades of rust and debris, was something that made her heart race. Fresh tire tracks in the soft earth. "Chief Rodriguez," she called. "Someone was here recently, really recently. Look." The tire tracks were clear evidence that their midnight visitor had driven right up to the locomotive, probably using a vehicle to search for and remove evidence more efficiently than could be done on foot. "These tracks are from last night," Dr. Chen confirmed after examining them carefully, "and they're from a heavy truck or SUV, something with enough power to haul away substantial evidence." As the full implications of their discovery sank in, Chief Rodriguez's expression grew grim. "If someone is actively trying to cover this up after all these years, it means they're afraid of what might be revealed, which means they probably have more to lose than just a family reputation. "What do you mean?" Edna asked. "I mean," Chief Rodriguez said slowly, "that the corruption Margaret documented might not have ended with Sheriff Cooper's generation. There might be people still alive, still in positions of power, who have been protecting this secret for 70 years. The investigation had begun as a historical mystery, a chance for an elderly woman to finally learn what had happened to her beloved sister. But as the afternoon shadows lengthened around Pete's backyard, it became clear that Margaret's murder had been just the beginning of a conspiracy that had reached across decades, touching lives and corrupting institutions in ways that were only now beginning to be understood. Margaret Rose Carraway had been silenced in 1949, but her voice had finally found its way out of the darkness. The question now was whether there were still people powerful enough and desperate enough to try to silence her again. The discovery of Margaret's remains and her carefully preserved evidence transformed Millbrook from a sleepy small town into the center of a criminal investigation that reached back 7 decades. Chief Rodriguez had contacted state authorities and federal investigators, understanding that the scope of corruption Margaret had documented was far beyond what local law enforcement could handle alone. But it was Margaret's final letter, the one found in the metal tube, that provided the key to understanding not just what had happened in 1949, but why someone was still trying to cover it up in the present day. Edna sat in her living room that evening, Margaret's letter spread before her on the coffee table like a sacred text. She'd read it dozens of times since Dr. Chen had carefully extracted it from its protective container, but each reading revealed new details that made her heart ache with pride for her sister's courage. "Listen to this part," she said to Dorothy, and Lila, who had joined her for what had become their daily evening conference about the investigation. "Sheriff Cooper told me that his operation extends beyond Millbrook. He has connections with sheriff's departments in 3 other counties, all of them collecting money for the same Chicago crime families. He said they've been doing this for years, and they have enough people in their pockets to make sure no one ever investigates too closely." Dorothy poured tea from the service that had belonged to her grandmother, the familiar ritual providing comfort in the midst of revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about their community. Margaret wasn't just documenting local corruption. She was uncovering a regional criminal network. Lila sat cross-legged on the carpet with Mews in her lap, both of them listening with the focused attention they brought to important adult conversations. Over the past week, Lila had become surprisingly sophisticated in her understanding of criminal investigations, asking questions that often cut straight to the heart of complex issues. "Miss Edna," she said now, "if the bad men had helpers in other counties, and if they were making lots of money, wouldn't some of their children and grandchildren still have that money today?" Edna paused in her reading, struck by the simplicity and accuracy of Lila's observation. "You're absolutely right, dear one. Crime families don't just disappear. They pass their operations and their secrets down through generations." "Which would explain why someone is still trying to cover this up," Dorothy added. "If Cooper's criminal network continued operating after 1949, there might be people alive today who built their lives on money stolen from victims like Robert and Margaret." The telephone rang, interrupting their discussion. Edna answered to find Chief Rodriguez on the other end, his voice tense with urgency. "Miss Carraway, I need you to be very careful tonight. We've had some developments that suggest you might be in danger." "What kind of developments?" Edna asked, her hand tightening on the receiver. "We ran the tire tracks from Pete's backyard through our database and got a match. The vehicle belongs to someone with connections to the Cooper family, Samuel. Cooper's grandson, Marcus Cooper Webb." The name hit Edna like a physical blow. "Webb, as in Deputy Webb." "Exactly. Marcus Cooper Webb is the grandson of Sheriff Cooper and the great-nephew of Deputy Webb. He's been living 2 towns over, working as a private security consultant, and according to our investigation, he's been very successful financially. More successful than someone in his profession should be." Edna felt the pieces clicking together in her mind. You think the criminal operation never really ended. You think it just got passed down through the families. That's exactly what I think. And I think Marcus Webb has been monitoring any attempts to investigate his family's past. When word started spreading around town about your sister's remains being found, he probably panicked. But how would he know about our investigation? Dorothy asked, having moved close enough to overhear the conversation. Chief Rodriguez's voice carried a note of grim certainty. Because someone in town has been keeping him informed. Someone who's been protecting the Cooper family's secrets for 70 years. The implications of this revelation settled over them, like a cold shadow. If there was still an active conspiracy to protect the Cooper family's criminal legacy, then Margaret's murder had been just the beginning of a pattern of corruption and cover-ups that had continued for decades. What should we do? Edna asked. Stay together tonight. Don't go anywhere alone and call me immediately if you notice anything suspicious. We're working on getting warrants to search Webb's property, but these things take time. After Chief Rodriguez hung up, the three women and Mews settled into what felt like a vigil. They'd become more than investigators. They'd become guardians of Margaret's truth, and that truth was apparently valuable enough for someone to kill for it, even 70 years later. I keep thinking about what Margaret wrote in her final letter. Edna said as the evening deepened around them, about wanting me to know that she tried to come home. All these years I thought she'd abandoned me, or that she didn't trust me enough to ask for help. But she did trust you, Lila observed, with the clarity that sometimes comes from young hearts. She trusted you to find her someday. She trusted you to tell her story. Dorothy reached over to squeeze her friend's hand. And she trusted you to see justice done, even if it took 70 years. As if summoned by their conversation about trust and justice, Margaret's presence seemed to fill the room. Not as a ghost or spirit, but as a voice that had finally been heard, a story that had finally found its listeners. There's something else, Edna said, reaching for a manila folder she'd brought from the library. I've been researching the Cooper and Webb families, trying to understand how their criminal operation might have evolved over the decades. She spread several documents across the coffee table. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, property records, and newspaper clippings that traced the two families through 3 generations. Look at this pattern, she said, pointing to a series of property purchases made by various Cooper and Webb family members over the years. Every few years, someone in one of these families acquires valuable property or starts a new business. Always with cash, always without any visible source of income. Dorothy studied the documents with the eye of someone who'd spent years managing family finances. These purchases are too large and too frequent to be legitimate. It looks like they've been laundering money through real estate investments for decades. And look at this, Edna continued, pointing to a more recent newspaper clipping. Marcus Cooper Webb was just elected to the county commissioner board. If he's continuing his family's criminal activities, he now has political power to protect his operations. Lila had been following the conversation with growing concern, but now she asked the question that none of the adults wanted to voice. If Mr. Webb is still doing bad things, and if he knows we found Margaret's evidence, what's he going to do to stop us? The question hung in the room like smoke, forcing them all to confront the reality that their investigation had moved beyond historical curiosity into active danger. Margaret had died because she'd threatened to expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of local law enforcement. If that corruption had continued and evolved over 70 years, then the stakes might be even higher now. He's going to try to discredit us, Edna said slowly, working through the possibilities. He's going to claim that we're just a group of imaginative women who've created a conspiracy theory out of coincidence and wishful thinking. But we have evidence, Dorothy protested. We have Margaret's journal, her photographs, her testimony, from beyond the grave. Evidence that he's had 70 years to prepare for, Edna replied. Evidence that he probably knows more about than we do, since he's had access to his family's records all his life. Mews chose that moment to jump onto the coffee table, carefully positioning himself among the documents as if to guard them with his presence. His green eyes moved from face to face, and his purr carried a note of determination that seemed to say he understood exactly what was at stake. "But here's what Marcus Cooper Webb doesn't understand," Lila said, scratching Mews behind the ears. "He doesn't understand that Margaret wasn't alone anymore. She has us now. She has people who believe her story and who won't let it be buried again." As the night deepened around them, they made their plans. Tomorrow, they would present Margaret's evidence to federal investigators who had no connection to local politics or family loyalties. Tomorrow, they would make sure that Margaret's voice was heard not just by their small community, but by people with the power to ensure that justice was finally served. But tonight, they would guard Margaret's truth the way she had guarded it 70 years ago, with courage, determination, and the unshakable belief that some secrets are too important to stay buried. Outside, a car drove slowly past Edna's house, its headlights lingering on the windows before moving on. Inside, 4 friends, 3 women, and 1 very determined cat prepared for the battle that would decide whether Margaret Rose Carraway's murder would finally be avenged, or whether it would be covered up for another 70 years. The Millbrook Community Center had never hosted a gathering quite like the one that assembled on the warm Tuesday evening in late July. Word had spread through the town's networks of coffee shop conversations, church committee meetings, and front porch discussions that something extraordinary was about to be revealed, something that would change how they understood their own history. Edna stood at the podium, Margaret's journal clutched in her hands like a prayer book. Behind her, a large screen displayed photographs that Chief Rodriguez and the federal investigators had helped her organize, images that would tell Margaret's story with visual evidence that no one could dismiss as imagination or wishful thinking. The audience filled every folding chair and lined the walls with standing observers. Dorothy sat in the front row with Lila beside her. Mews curled contentedly in Lila's lap, as if he understood his role as a founding member of Margaret's investigative team. Pete Morrison had come, along with Eleanor Mitchell from the senior center, and dozens of other neighbors whose families had lived in Millbrook for generations. But it was the presence of Marcus Cooper Webb that made the evening feel electric with tension. He sat near the back of the room, his expensive suit and carefully styled hair making him stand out among the casual dress of his fellow townspeople. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes never left Edna's face. "My friends and neighbors," Edna began, her voice carrying clearly through the room's acoustic system, "I want to tell you about my sister Margaret, who disappeared 70 years ago during her honeymoon. Until recently, I thought I would go to my grave never knowing what happened to her." She clicked to the first slide, Margaret's wedding photograph, showing a radiant young woman in a dress that must have taken months to save for. A soft murmur went through the audience as people recognized the resemblance to Edna, even across the decades. Margaret Rose Carraway was 22 when she married Robert Henderson in June 1949. They were planning a honeymoon trip through small towns like ours, traveling by train and seeing the countryside. It should have been the beginning of a beautiful life together. The next slide showed the newspaper clipping announcing the couple's disappearance, followed by the brief article reporting Robert's death and the fruitless search for Margaret. Edna could see people in the audience leaning forward, their interest caught by this glimpse into their town's past. "For 70 years, I believed the official story. Robert had an accident, and Margaret, traumatized and confused, wandered off and was lost. But 3 weeks ago, a remarkable little girl named Lila Henderson made a discovery that changed everything." Lila's face turned pink as dozens of heads turned toward her, but she sat up straighter in her chair, understanding that this was her moment to represent all the children who see truth, where adults see only what they expect to see. Lila bought an old locomotive at a yard sale, Edna continued, and her cat, Mews, found something hidden inside that locomotive, something that had been waiting 70 years for someone to discover it. The screen now displayed Margaret's journal, opened to the first page where her name was inscribed in careful penmanship. The audience grew quieter, sensing that they were about to hear something that would challenge their assumptions about their peaceful community. My sister left behind a detailed record of what really happened during her honeymoon week, Edna said, her voice growing stronger with each word. She documented a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of our local law enforcement, and she paid for that documentation with her life. She began reading from Margaret's journal, starting with the entries that described her. Growing fear of Robert's gambling debts and the dangerous men who were demanding payment. With each entry, the audience's murmur grew more pronounced, as people began to understand that the story they were hearing wasn't just historical curiosity, it was criminal evidence. When she reached Margaret's description of witnessing Robert's murder, several people in the audience gasped audibly. When she read Margaret's account of Sheriff Cooper's involvement in the killing, the room became so quiet that the only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning system. Margaret didn't just disappear, Edna said, pausing to look directly at Marcus Cooper Webb. She was murdered by the very people who were supposed to protect her, and her murder was covered up by a conspiracy that profited from corruption and violence. The screen now showed the photographs Margaret had taken, clear images of Sheriff Cooper and Deputy Webb meeting with known criminals, exchanging money, and posing beside what federal investigators had confirmed was Margaret's burial site. These photographs were taken by my sister in the days before her death, Edna explained. She was building a case against the criminal network that had infiltrated our sheriff's department. She was trying to document the truth so that justice could be served. Marcus Cooper Webb stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, with the sound that made several people turn to look at him. His face had gone pale, but his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being in control. "This is all very interesting historical speculation," he said loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "But I think we need to be careful about making accusations against people who can't defend themselves. Sheriff Cooper and Deputy Webb are both dead. How can we possibly know if these so-called documents are authentic?" It was exactly the challenge Edna had been expecting, and she was ready for it. "Mr. Webb raises an important question about authenticity," Edna said calmly, not allowing his interruption to break her composure. "Which is why I'm grateful that federal investigators have spent the past 2 weeks analyzing every piece of evidence we found." She clicked to the next slide, which showed official documents from the FBI's forensic laboratories. Margaret's journal, photographs, and personal effects have been authenticated using techniques that weren't available in 1949. Carbon dating confirms the age of the materials. Handwriting analysis confirms that Margaret wrote every word herself. And photographic analysis confirms that the images were taken with equipment consistent with 1949 technology. Marcus Webb remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. "Even if these documents are from 1949, that doesn't prove they tell the truth. A frightened young woman might have imagined conspiracies that didn't exist." "You're right to be skeptical," Edna replied smoothly. "Which is why we didn't rely only on Margaret's testimony. We found corroborating evidence." The screen now displayed bank records, property deeds, and financial documents that federal investigators had uncovered during their expanded investigation. When investigators began examining the Cooper and Webb family finances from 1949 forward, they found a pattern of unexplained wealth that continued for decades after Sheriff Cooper's death. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the audience as people saw the evidence of systematic money laundering that had enriched both families across 3 generations. Dorothy watched Marcus Webb's face carefully, noting how his confident expression was beginning to crack under the weight of documented proof. But the most compelling corroborating evidence, Edna continued, came from an unexpected source. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of a frail, elderly man in a hospital bed. This is Anthony Rossetti, age 94, currently residing in a federal witness protection program. Mr. Rossetti was a member of the Chicago crime family that Sheriff Cooper and Deputy Webb were working for in 1949. The room fell completely silent. Even Marcus Webb seemed to be holding his breath. 3 days ago, when federal agents showed Mr. Rossetti the photographs that Margaret had taken, he identified everyone in them. He confirmed that Sheriff Cooper was collecting gambling debts for his family's organization, and he provided details about other murders that were committed and covered up using the same methods that killed Robert and Margaret. Edna's voice grew stronger as she continued. Mr. Rossetti told investigators that the Cooper-Webb operation was so successful that it continued operating well into the 1970s, passed down from father to son like a family business. He said they were particularly good at intimidating potential witnesses and eliminating anyone who threatened to expose their activities. Marcus Webb's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You're taking the word of a criminal over the reputation of respected law enforcement officers. My grandfather and great-uncle served this community with honor. Your grandfather," Edna said quietly, "murdered my sister." The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus Webb opened his mouth to respond, but Chief Rodriguez stood up from his seat near the back of the room. "Mr. Webb," Chief Rodriguez said formally, "I think this would be a good time for you to exercise your right to remain silent." The chief walked forward, pulling handcuffs from his belt as he moved. "Marcus Cooper Webb, you are under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice, tampering with evidence, and interfering with a federal investigation." As Chief Rodriguez read Webb his rights, the audience sat in stunned silence. Several people were weeping quietly, whether from shock, relief, or delayed grief for injustices that had been buried for too long. Lila watched the arrest with wide eyes, Mews purring steadily in her arms, as if he understood that justice was finally being served. When Marcus Webb was led away in handcuffs, she looked up at her grandmother, with a question that had been building in her mind. "Grammy, what happens now? Is Margaret's story finished?" Dorothy considered the question carefully, looking around. The room at neighbors who were processing revelations that would change how they understood their community's history. "I think, sweetheart, that Margaret's story is just beginning. For 70 years only she knew the truth. Now everyone knows it." Edna stepped down from the podium and walked to where Lila sat in the front row. "Thank you, dear one," she said, softly, kneeling beside the little girl who had started everything with her $5 purchase and her cat's curiosity. "Margaret would be so proud to know that it was someone with your brave heart who finally brought her home." As the crowd began to disperse, people stopped to speak with Edna, offering condolences for her loss and admiration for her courage in seeking the truth. Some were family members of other victims, people who had suspected for years that their loved ones' deaths hadn't been properly investigated. The locomotive in Pete's backyard was no longer just a rusted piece of railroad history. It had become a monument to the power of truth, the importance of justice, and the remarkable things that can happen when a little girl and her cat decide to invest $5 in an adventure. Margaret Rose Carraway had finally come home. 3 months later, on a crisp October morning when the maple trees had turned the color of Margaret's hair, Millbrook gathered again, this time not to hear revelations about the past, but to celebrate healing and remembrance. The old locomotive still sat in Pete's backyard, but it had been transformed into something beautiful. Local artisans had carefully restored its exterior while preserving the places where Margaret had hidden her evidence, turning them into small memorial windows where visitors could see displays of her photographs and journal entries. Flowering vines now grew up its sides, and the area around it had been converted into a garden where roses bloomed beside benches for quiet reflection. Margaret's Garden, the small bronze plaque read, in memory of Margaret Rose Carraway, 1927 to 1949, whose voice was silenced but whose truth could not be buried. Edna knelt beside a newly planted rosebush, its deep red blooms a living tribute to her sister's memory. At 73, she moved with a lightness that hadn't been there 6 months ago, as if finally knowing what had happened to Margaret had lifted a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to walk without it. The red roses were always her favorite, she said to Lila, who was helping her spread mulch around the plant's base. She used to say they reminded her that beautiful things could grow even in difficult soil. Lila, now 8, and officially the most famous child detective in 3 counties, worked with the careful attention she brought to all important tasks. Mews supervised from his perch on the locomotive's restored platform, his orange fur bright, against the gleaming green paint that local volunteers had applied with loving care. "Miss Edna," Lila said, sitting back on her heels to survey their work, "do you think Margaret knows about the garden? Do you think she knows that people remember her story now?" Edna paused in her planting, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Over the past months, she'd thought often about Margaret's presence in their lives, not as something supernatural, but as the continuing influence of love and courage that doesn't end with death. "I think Margaret knows," she said finally. "Not because of magic or ghosts, but because love doesn't disappear when people die. It just changes form. Margaret's love became your curiosity, and Mews's persistence, and all the people who helped us find the truth." Dorothy approached, carrying a thermos of coffee and a picnic basket that had become their standard equipment for Saturday morning. Garden maintenance. At 79, she'd discovered that having a mystery to solve and a garden to tend had given her more energy than she'd felt in years. "The newspaper wants to do another follow-up story," she announced, settling onto one of the memorial benches. "They're calling it 6 months later, how a small town healed from hidden trauma." The newspaper coverage had been extensive, first local, then regional, then national, as the story of Margaret's 70-year delayed justice captured imaginations across the country. But more importantly, the investigation had opened doors for other families who'd suspected that their loved ones' deaths hadn't been properly investigated during the Cooper Webb years. 17 cases reopened, Edna said, shaking her head at the scope of corruption that Margaret's evidence had revealed. 17 families who finally have answers, thanks to my sister's courage. The federal investigation had uncovered a criminal network that had operated for nearly 3 decades, enriching multiple families through systematic corruption and violence. Marcus Cooper Webb was now serving a federal sentence, and several of his associates had been arrested on charges ranging from money laundering to accessory to murder. "Grammy," Lila said, "Mrs. Patterson at school asked if I wanted to write a book about what happened. She said it could help other kids understand that their voices matter, even when they're small." Dorothy smiled at her granddaughter, remembering the determined 7-year-old who'd insisted on spending her allowance on a rusted locomotive. "What do you think about that idea?" "I think Margaret would like it," Lila said thoughtfully. "She wanted her story to be told, and maybe my story could help other kids know that they should pay attention to things that don't seem right, even if adults say they're being silly." Mews chose that moment to jump down from the locomotive and wind himself around Lila's legs, purring loudly. Over the months, he'd become something of a celebrity himself, the cat who'd solved a 70-year-old murder case. But he seemed unimpressed by fame, preferring to spend his time ensuring that Margaret's garden was properly protected from threats both real and imagined. As the morning sun climbed higher, other visitors began arriving at the memorial garden. Some were tourists drawn by the national news coverage, but most were local people who'd made the garden part of their weekly routines. Children played on the restored locomotive while their parents read Margaret's story on the memorial plaques, learning about the importance of speaking truth even when it's dangerous. Pete Morrison arrived with his usual Saturday contribution, fresh flowers from his greenhouse and stories about the visitors who'd come to see the locomotive during the week. At 75, he'd become an unofficial tour guide, sharing the story of how a little girl's $5 investment had uncovered one of the region's largest criminal conspiracies. "Had a group from the State University yesterday," he reported, settling onto a bench beside Dorothy. "Criminology students studying how corruption gets passed down through generations. Professor said Margaret's case is going to be used in textbooks." "Margaret always wanted to be a teacher," Edna said softly. "I suppose she's still teaching, just not in the way she planned." As the day warmed and the garden filled with the gentle sounds of families enjoying the peaceful space, Lila found herself thinking about the difference between endings and beginnings. The mystery of Margaret's disappearance had ended, but the story of Margaret's courage was just beginning to spread into the world. The locomotive, once a symbol of broken dreams and buried secrets, now represented hope, justice, and the remarkable things that could happen when people refused to let truth stay hidden. Margaret had finally come home to Millbrook, and she'd brought with her the knowledge that some voices are too important to silence, no matter how long it takes for them to be heard. In the garden that bore her name, surrounded by people who'd learned to listen for truth even when it whispered from unexpected places, Margaret Rose Carraway's story continued to bloom like the roses that would return each spring, eternal and beautiful and impossible to silence again.